This week, the Parshas Shoftim is a mitzvah to appoint judges, a bezdin, in every community. Not only there's a mitzvah to appoint judges, there's a mitzvah to appoint law enforcers to enforce the verdicts of the court. As Chazal say, without law enforcement, a judgment means nothing, because people will only heed the verdict of the court if it's enforced. Enforced means it's literally, there are consequences if you don't accept the ruling of the court. Shoftim v'shotrim titel l'cho b'chol shorecho. Judges and law enforcers you should appoint in all your communities. Asher Hashem Elokecha nosei l'cho l'shvotecha, which Hashem is giving to you in each one of your tribes. V'shoftos om mishpat tzedek, and they should judge the people a judgment which is a righteous judgment, a correct judgment that's understood. I mean, if they're not going to rule correctly, it's understood, they're not judges. But yet the Torah says, and the court should rule nishpat tzedek, a just ruling. So we'll see in a moment. What happens if you appoint judges? They mean well, but they're not qualified to judge. They don't have the qualifications, they don't have the background, they don't have the experience, but they mean well. They're good people. You realize without the qualifications and the experience and the mentoring, the judgment cannot be mishpat tzedek. So it's irrelevant what your intention is, but factually, if the judgment is not mishpat tzedek, this is not a proper court. Let's see. Shoftim v'shotrim. Shoftim dayonim aposkim sadin. Shoftim are judges who actually adjudicate and they give the definitive verdict. Shotrim, who are the shotrim? Harodim somach mitzvoson. They direct the people after their command. Shemakim v'kovsim b'makom b'ritzua. If they have to actually hit or bind a person or compel a person with a rod or with a whip, achikabel olav din hashofet, and the person accepts the ruling of the judge. For instance, the Gemara tells us if a person doesn't want to put on tefillin, doesn't want to build a sukkah, the Gemara tells us, "Makan oso achetetzi nafsho." The court is qualified and permitted to beat the man. So there's a question. Achetetzi nafsho does mean that even if he should die under the whip, under the rod, or achetetzi nafsho, up to that point. They're authorized by the Torah to do this, to enforce the mitzvahs of the Torah. If there's a verdict, they have a right to beat the person, to flog the person, to whip the person, to accept the laws of the Torah. Otherwise, what's the value of a law? Unless there's an enforcement system, the law means nothing. And this is what we read in Pirkei Avos. Even if you're not under Jewish rule, having mispal b'shlom shel malchus, you should pray for the welfare of the government. Shel moli morosh shel malchus, if not for fear of government, Israel chayim below. Literally, it'll lead to a level of anarchy, chaos, that people will eat one another alive. That's how important it's to have a law enforcement system. That's morosh shel malchus. So even though you may have the most qualified judges, but if you cannot enforce those rulings, the verdicts of the court, then it all means nothing. Meaning a law on the books means nothing unless the law actually is implemented, and it's only implemented through law enforcement. Because people themselves, they do what they want to do. Everybody feels, even when the judgment is correct, they feel they've been somehow victimized. They're not getting a fair deal, a fair shake. Said Shoftim v'shotrim tidim kol shorecho. What's shol shorecho? B'chol ir v'ir. Every community has to have a bezdin. let's skip V'shovtu Esa'om, Manei Dayona Mumchim V'tzadikim. Lishpot Tzedek. You should appoint judges who are experts, but it's not enough to be experts. Tzadikim. They have to be righteous, because they're not righteous. They have no conscience. They may know the law, but because of their various conflicts of interest and lack of Yirut Shamayim, the judgment will not be a correct, righteous judgment. So firstly, the judge has to be fully versed and expert in his area. In addition, he has to be a tzaddik. Tzaddik means he has to be a person. It's not enough to have a cheskes kashrus. Well, every Jew has a presumed status. He's a kosher Jew. Tzaddik means that he's not subject to conflicts. And as a result of that, you're getting as close as you can to what? To have mishpat tzedek. There's a question I always ask. What discerns between a human being and any other living species? Every other human species, its function, every aspect of its function is based on its instinct. Its behavior is purely instinctive. Any living creature other than human being cannot act and function and behave differently than the instinct directs it and dictates. But a human being has free choice. Although we have certain instincts, but choice allows us to override whatever the instinct may be. And every moment of our lives, it's dictated and directed through what? Through free choice. Why? Because the purpose of existence is based on our record, our performance, and every moment you're given a choice how to behave, how to act. And based on your own initiative, that will determine what you're deserving, what level of liability or culpability you have. Okay? Now, a Bezdin, when we speak about, there are two types of Sanhedrin. There's a Sanhedrin Gedola, that's the High Court of Israel. That they convened on the Temple Mount, in the Lishkas Agozis, in the Chamber of Cut Stone, that was right alongside the sanctuary. That court was comprised of 70 judges, and you had a presiding judge, 71 judges. Every other court, it's referred to as Sanhedrin Kitano, had 23 judges. Every one of these judges had to be a mumche. He had to be a somoch, he had to be ordained. The caliber of the ordination had to be from Moshe Rabbeinu. Otherwise, he couldn't rule on many areas. For instance, the death penalty, lashes, penalties. They're not able to rule unless they have this qualification. Monetary, they're able to rule, and that's even a court of 3 judges, even if they don't have this qualification, but that's purely rabbinical. On a Torah level, even for ordinary monetary laws, they have to have this qualification. However, because it was so difficult to find that caliber judge, and a person, if he'd have a claim, he'd never be able to take him to court. So Chazal said, even an ordinary person, what we call a hedjot, if he meets certain basic criteria, he's qualified to be a judge. But it's rabbinical. It's based on the principle, as we discussed, hefker bez and hefker. The ruling on a Torah level is not really a valid ruling. It's only because Chazal have the ability to transfer ownership rights to possessions. Therefore, whatever they rule, therefore their ruling has value within the context of the Torah, based on hefker bez and hefker. But on Torah level, every community has to have mumchim. So the question is, you have judges. Now, when we speak, every community has to have a bezdin. How many members have to be in that community? How many inhabitants have to live in that town or village to require a court? So there's a machlokes of the Mishnah in Sanhedrin. One opinion is that if you have as few as 120 people living in a city, you have to have a bezdin. Another opinion is you have to have a community of 240 people. We're not talking about a large number of people. So even it's 240 people, you have a court which is in place, that if anybody should violate the law, there'll be a judgment, and the law will be enforced because you have law enforcers. So what is the chance anybody who's rational or in his right mind would cross the line, knowing the consequences and the level of liability he would have? Could you imagine? A person eats a kazayas nevela, not kosher meat, and he's forewarned. What is the liability to that person? He has to get malchus. He's evaluated. Maximum he gets 39 lashes. If he will die under the whip, so they evaluate him, how many lashes could he take? If a person gets lashes, you realize he becomes incapacitated for quite a while till he recovers from those lashes. So who in his right mind, knowing the consequences and the ramifications of misbehavior, because if he's forewarned and the court gives a ruling, and you just can't push off the court because you have law enforcers, who's actually going to cross those lines? A person speaks Lashon Hara in a public setting. A word gets back to the court. They're going to summon him right away and say, what's going on over here? And even rabbinically, they have a right to flog him. What we call makus mardus. So who in his right mind? If that's the case, here at Kadosh Baruch Hu gives us bechira, free choice, and yet he creates a system that it's very difficult to actually function within free choice. We're really forced to behave a certain way because no one in his right mind will behave differently because of the consequences of misbehavior. But yet the system doesn't allow one to do as he chooses. So of course everybody's going in the right direction. Why isn't this an infringement on free choice? Today, unfortunately, it's the Wild West. You have to be of the select few who have the background, the understanding or conscience that they make the right choice. But outside of that, society is not compelling anybody to make the right choice in terms of behavior within the context of the Torah. But according to the system which the Torah sets in place, when the system was in place, where's choice? You have no choice. Or it's limited to a great degree. So how do we understand this? So what one said is this. We had read last week in the Parsha, Moshe Rabbeinu says to Klal Yisrael, Bonim atem l'Shem Elokechem. What is the relationship between ourselves and HaKadosh Baruch Hu? It's Avinu. Not only is it Malkeinu, but it's also Avinu. It's a father-son relationship. A father, due to the love that he has to his child, he will not allow that child to cross lines. He'll give him plenty leeway to make decisions in his life on the upgrade, but on the downgrade, there are many areas he's not going to allow him to cross those lines due to the relationship between a father and a son. So the son will say to the father, what about all the other people out there? Look the way they're behaving. They said, you realize, but that's not my child. That's them, you're my child. Klal Yisrael is held to another standard. Within the parameters of choice, we have enough area to exercise choice. For instance, putting on tefillin is not a question. Observing Shabbos is not a question. Because if you violate, the court will rule and they're law enforcers. What about when you do the mitzvah? Do you do the mitzvah lishma? Do you do the mitzvah shlo lishma? What exactly, qualitatively, what's the quality of your Torah observance, of your mitzvah observance? How much time do you study? All this is within the realm of choice. We have enough area to make choices, to succeed and fail, to have worthiness or culpability and liability. We'd have to say, you realize if you kill, you're going to be put to death. God forbid. If you violate Shabbos, you're going to be put to death. Or you're going to be flogged if you don't put on tefillin. Because it says, Makaros ache nafsho. You don't build a sukkah, you can hear the music. The courts can enforce that. But when you sit in the sukkah, how often do you sit in the sukkah? How you do the sukkah? how you study, whatever it is. That's how the choice of the Jew manifests itself. So therefore, that's not considered an infringement on the choice, and and that's why there's greater liability for the Jew than the non-Jew. However, the Gemara tells us that before the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash, the court actually left its location. The lower courts could only rule on capital cases only if the high court, what we call the Sanhedrin Condola, is in place. They convene in the Lishkas Agozis, in the chamber of cut stone. What happens if they should leave that location? Even the lesser courts are not able to rule on those particular areas. The Jews themselves failed so seriously before the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash that the High Court actually abandoned the Lishkas Agozis because the Bezdin would have become a slaughterhouse. It became so out of control. Meaning, the fact is, the courts became corrupted, everything became corrupted. Whole society, Jewish society became corrupted. So the courts, if they would actually enforce it, it became impossible. Even if they enforce it, the court is not meant to be a place where we just continuously kill people. If Jewish society lost their sense of conscience, Hashem says it's ready to pull the plug. And that ultimately, 40 years before the Churban Abayis, the Sanhedrin, they left the Lishkas Agozis because the lower court should not be able to rule on many cases because it would have been out of control. Because it was out of control. So again, Shoftim v'Shotrim, it's not an infringement of our choice. It's to set the standard of what God expects of us in terms of what choice should be and what are the parameters of those choices.
Rabbi,
Yes.
we're trying to understand. When the Sanhedrin Gedola elected to leave, so this would compromise, the Sanhedrin Ketana, as the Rav just said. So now, so now what? So who did anything?
Nothing.
So now it
was the Wild West. It was the Wild West. They were hoping for the best. They gave Musar. They did give Musar.